Holy shit! We're taking a break from the live symposium to do a live record to do a pre-record, Johnny.
Yeah.
We're breaking the fourth wall within our fifth wall break because I'm assuming that our friend Rawpath has something there where the fourth wall is being broken, so we're doing the fifth wall at this time simultaneously. Yep. But I'm super excited for this one. We've got an actual PhD holder of the proper certificate and credentials here to talk today about Max Stirner. And as always, Scobie-Wan over here knows absolutely nothing about Max Stirner, so this entire thing is to ultimately teach him and our audience who Max Stirner was, and potentially can be in the future. So without any further ado, Dr. Adam, would you like to give the elevator pitch, tell our people who you are, and we'll get into the conversation about Max Stirner.
No, yeah, thank you both for having me. So yeah, hi. So I'm Adam Jones. I'm from a podcast called Acid Horizon. We do a lot of continental philosophy, theory, psychoanalysis. We also run our own sort of seminars and reading groups and do stuff like our own books, as well as the occasional pornographic tarot deck, just to keep things interesting. But yeah, I did my undergrad thesis and then my doctoral thesis, which disproved the first one, on the philosophy of Max Stirner, his implications of sort of the history of radical politics, and particularly around anarchism, communism, and the ideas of insurrectionary theory today.
Hell yeah, man. I mean, it's in my opinion, remarkable that you were able to convince somebody in academia to let you do that. Because it's just he's one of these guys that's been kind of stigmatized for so long. And he's kind of this back figure that's like in the background of all sorts of really cool stuff that I grew up reading. So, within my milieu and my ideas, he was kind of in the forefront. And, actually going out there and touching grass and talking to normal people, they don't really know who he is very, very much. You had to kind of grow up in anti-war circles and kind of writing letters to Ted Kaczynski like I was when I was in high school. So, if you grew up in those circles, obviously Max Stirner is a guy you've heard of. But what would you want to just say briefly if you could crunch your dissertation into, an elevator pitch, what would be the most important kind of key points that you would think people should know about him and so on?
Yeah. So I'm going to not put it too much in the context of dissertation because it's intervening in a kind of literature and in sort of debate that's already going on. But I think just to sort of also introduce one like Max Stirner. I mean, so he's born in 1806, right? That is at the death of 1,000-year-old empire that has basically set the legal, political, customary standards for Europe for literally at that point 1,000 years, what we now know as the Holy Roman Empire. Pardon me. But yeah, he's born sort of at the dawn of this complete collapse in the institutions of what would then become Germany. And he has a relatively sort of quite sad life, but what matters for him is he goes to sort of the lectures of the biggest philosopher of his day. That's this guy Hegel, who builds this giant sort of all-comprehending attempt at a philosophical system. And at the time, around his sort of I think late 30s, early 40s, he goes to Berlin after being a teacher for a while, and he gets involved with this debating club called Die Freien, the Free Ones, that happens in the back of an old wine bar called Hippel's on Friedrichstrasse in Berlin. And where all of these debates happen, this sets the sort of philosophical stage for a lot of political thought that comes after it, because when he goes into this circle, it's around 1843, 1844, and then in Germany, this period is known as the Vormers, the pre-March period, because 4 years later, a set of revolutions kick off across the entire continent, which we know now, sort of the revolutions of 1848. I think it's the same revolution that Les Miserables is based on in the version in France. And so he is writing at the cusp of all of these debates about, we've just been in one dead society, a new society is coming, and this is what capitalism is, and there are going to be these political and economic tensions. How should the revolution be fought? And at the time, you got all these different thinkers saying that, we've all been to Hegel, and we've all come up with the same idea together, which is, we read him as saying this: the essence of God, all these ideas that we have in religion are just human ideas that we've lost sight of, but we've projected outwards onto the spiritual plane. But actually, it's all us. And so we need to take back religion for humanity, not by being more religious, but by being more human. And there's different ways of figuring out that idea, right? Where they're going to revolutionize society by making it explicit that we exist in society together as members of a collective human species. We don't need a religion for that. And this is why these ideas, for example, there's these two guys, Bruno Bauer, who we most know for his quite anti-Semitic works later on that Marx responds to. Well, actually, not at the time. And by Feuerbach. And they both essentially believe that through philosophy, we can understand that religion is kind of a false idol. It's just humans projecting themselves outwards. And through this, revelation, we can have a revolution, essentially. Moving from revelation to revolution. Stirner is sort of sitting in the back, smoking like a cheap cigarillo and going that, you've just replaced God with man, and man is just as abstract here. Because they're talking about we need to do this all for the human species, and Stern has to be there like, well, I'm not the human species. If anything, no one's the human species. Who gets to speak for all humanity? And that's why he starts by speaking of himself. He starts by using these philosophical narratives and concepts of this great unfolding human history and says, well, what about, forget the universal human, forget the essence of humanity beyond all humans. What about me, the particular individual? And he doesn't mean individual in the sense that, Ayn Rand's talking about it. He's talking about the individual as something which escapes being subsumed under these philosophical concepts and narratives. He thinks, well, there's something that exceeds all of that, because when we use language, and we can't not use language in doing philosophy, we can all, and this is a point from Hegel, we can never quite say what we mean, So say, I'm drinking this beer right here, right now. Now, everything is this here and now. I can't quite fix what I mean. There's has to be a certain history of concepts and narratives kind of to make sure I can say what I mean. But in the immediate moment, language can never quite say what we mean, even if I say I, because you're an I and you're an I, eyes. This is part of the tension, and Stirner's going to exploit that to try and find a vision of what human life is that doesn't need to be subordinated to an absolute concept of it, and requires us to be more in the encounter without, essentially, so that we can live with each other without necessarily having to know each other or to make each other knowable to our own concepts. That was a bit rambly, but hopefully that's a good intro.
That was a beautiful diatribe there. I love that.
I don't think you rambled at all.
That was actually the most coherent diatribe we've had on the show.
Yeah.
Up until this point. So you've done this. You've done this before, clearly. So yeah, basically, Johnny, you understand Hegel from our book as the guy with the triangle, and with the triangle at each point of those triangles and all of that. And then these guys, the German Silly Billy School of Philosophy, went to bars, and a bar in particular, and were telling each other jokes and all sorts of crass humor while they were drinking. And one of the things my audience really wants to know about and kind of drive home and explore is their use of humor and their use of satire, and how at the time that was in their minds actually like a revolutionary act, because there were people literally very very shortly before them that were killed for it. Their books were burned. They were exiled from their communities and all sorts of things. I mean, Galileo was basically forced to put his most pivotal work into the form of satire to get it across to people. You know what I mean? So they're coming out of this like time honored tradition of revolutionary satirists, and I mean, coming to and doing so at the time when the the Holy Roman Empire was collapsing and was completely completely in the rubble. So they're kind of at that point, like, how do we clean up the rubble? How do we take that rubble and do we reconstruct it? Do we just sweep it away and build on top of it? What they're trying to figure out what they do, and they're using crass humor to do that. You know what I mean? And that's part of the tradition that our book is
well, it's pretty crass,
still within. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
These guys were basically one of the first schools, the first classes of philosophers who were actually free from a lot of the shackles of the Christian church that they had on academia at the time. You know what I mean? It took a lot of people fighting against that for them to have that freedom to then explore. And Bruno Bauer was he was actually canceled for his book back in the day. And, I think several of these people had to write under pen names so that they could, get their stuff across, because there were still censors from, the government, but it wasn't, explicitly coming from the church the same way that it was, you know what I mean? And they were fighting for, against the kings for a republic and, trying to make progress and all that. And at the time they were looking at America, the colonies as this potential. Karl Marx wrote a letter to Abraham Lincoln.
Really?
Yeah, saying, hey, power with you. We're in favor of him. He actually called him a comrade. It was cool stuff. So like these people were we like conservatives and all that try to look at them as being like these evil commies and but like a lot of time they were on the right side of history. You know what I mean? The name Bruno Bauer, he did that. That he was racist and all that, anti-Semitic and all that. Yeah. But within our community, he's known for being the guy who invented Jesus mythicism as we know it today. Right. So he's the guy who basically looked at the Bible and said, this Jesus guy probably didn't exist. And that stirred up a lot of shit and still does to this day. You know what I mean? Like still to this day, people are taking that idea and running with it. But he himself was a comedian and a satirist. So like, having that mind, you can read the stuff and go, this kind of looks like a stage play. This looks like, a reconstruction and a, like a stage play, like Dionysus or something. And, Attis and, taking all that stuff. And, eventually you get that, Zeitgeist documentary on early YouTube and all that shit. But like kind of all fell downhill from, from them kind of having the shackles loosened from the church and being able to explore the text and stuff like that. So that's also a diatribe that I just did there. So I see your diatribe and I raise you one diatribe. So we're playing diatribe chess here.
So was he like one of the main people in this like community, or was like you said he's sitting in the back smoking a cigarello? How like involved was he? Or I literally, when he says I don't know anything about this, I'm a jock who learned how to use a computer. I have no idea what he's talking about.
So he wasn't one of the two ringleaders. There were at least two big people in the factions. There was Feuerbach and there was Bauer, and they both had roughly the same idea, but couched in sort of opposite. They approach it from opposite ends. I mean, Feuerbach was more on the side of talking about the human species, whereas Bauer thought that it was his unique, intellect that could help him. I mean, a lot of people understand Stirner the wrong way. They think he's Bauer, because Bauer is like, I'm so smart. So basically, the reason why Bauer did this was because there was, we're talking about the Jesus mythicism stuff. He's developing that off of someone else called David Strauss, who wrote a book called The Life of Jesus, critically examined and put this thesis forward. But originally, Bauer, who was sort of this up and coming academic superstar, he was sent to refute that guy. To refute the Jesus myth stuff. In order to do that, he said, I'm going to use Hegel's logic textbook, and I'm going to show that the Bible's narrative necessarily unfolds along this logic. And then he did that, and he said, see, it folds necessarily along this logic. And then he was like, well, in that case, the truth of the Bible is dependent on my intellect and not the other way around. It's like God doesn't need you to prove that he exists. Otherwise then God will have to say, as theologians, thank you. Otherwise I wouldn't be here, And so he ends up having this quite big head here. And him and Stirner are friends, but Stirner's usually the guy who says you're all wrong. Because in this in this sort of milieu, it's a little bit like Maoist cult, because everyone is constantly going up to each other and going, you're still quite Christian. You haven't, taken back what religion has taken away from us in our concepts. And Stirner's going to say, the fact you're harassing each other means this is basically a church. You haven't escaped the dynamic of, saying that you're not free of sin if you just replace Christianity with the human species, or sin with, unreason or illogical sort of stuff. It's kind of like why new atheism is, in many ways, just a kind of Protestant heresy rather than a kind of atheism. I mean, there was a big dispute about, Stirner thought a lot of the atheists of his day were pious. He said, we have pious atheists. Yeah. But he was just sort of in the back. He was one of the older ones. He was one of the few ones to see like Hegel speak. So he had that authority there. But he didn't want to be a leader or a thought leader here. He always sort of said, I've got this book I'm working on, and you're all going to be like blown away by it. And then one day it did come out under a different date than it's actually printed as, because of avoiding the censors. And then everyone, I've got a collection of writings called The Young Hegelians, which is the name of this group. And after the year to which Stirner wrote his book, almost all of the pieces in that collection are now just responding to Stirner. he was sort of like, they're all debating about, you're still a Christian. No, you're still a Christian. And he just pulls out a pin, just throws a grenade in there in the form of his book, and then everyone turns around. They start arguing with him instead.
Yeah, it's the classic, Eris throwing the chaos apple into the wedding. The start of the Trojan War. Somebody's got to start it. You know what I mean? So it might as well be the guy that's puffing on his cigarette in the back, laughing at everybody already. It's the Greek god of satire was Momos, who walked around with a mirror, right, and said the most vulgar shit to you and held a mirror in front of his face, so that it was reminding you that you're the one actually doing it. I'm just doing a character, Right. So they were, and he had a couple like normal day jobs. The guy was a translator, like professionally. He translated a bunch of really cool books. I think he translated Say's Law for and I think he did. Didn't he also translate Adam Smith? Is that also?
Yeah, he translated the Wealth of Nations, into English.
Yeah.
He was a school teacher before that.
Right.
He worked at a girls' gymnasium, and he left. He thought, well, we're not too sure if he left because he thought the book would sell loads of copies, or he thought he'd be fired for writing it, which is kind of weird given it's a pseudonym. But it's a pseudonym that is obviously kind of known. He was in real life, his birth name was Johann Caspar Schmidt. He became Max Stirner because of Stern, forehead, so big forehead. That was.
I like it. All right.
And he's the only one of this group, with the exceptions of Marx and Engels, who we have like a proper biography of in English. But it's a biography written by someone who is way too adoring of Stirner, so I don't know how accurate its narratives often are. But
yeah, it was Sycophant that wrote a book about him, and you know how that goes. You're not getting any of the the stuff that falls in the cracks there, you know what I mean? Which is always the juicy, interesting stuff,
Getting right back to the Jesus stuff.
Yeah, kind of, it's interesting to, be a sycophant over somebody who's telling you to be an individual. It's weird. Yeah, it's bizarre. It's like, do people actually read the book, or they own the book and then kind of read some stuff and flip through it and go, oh, this is interesting? Because, within the tradition of the German Silly school of philosophy is you're building up the ideas to break them down. You're messing with your audience. Like they're meant to interact with it. And a lot of it is almost playing like little literary pranks on your audience. Nietzsche does this as well. He says, he's got snares and traps all throughout his work, and he'll build up an entire idea and make you invested in it, only just to go, oh, that's entirely stupid, tear it all down completely. And Nietzsche's body of work is also largely satire as well. That book, Ecce Homo, Nietzsche's Last Laugh. I find those guys' sense of humor and their wordplay and their approach at like making each other laugh and making each other look silly while drawing from the classics, right? Like Marx references Horace 7 times in Volume 1 of Capital, right? Like that's not an accident. Who references Horace 7 times unless you've sat down and you've read and you understand Horace? The only, and that's a thing that you go through if you actually study the satires and you write in the satires and you're looking for satire for, your influence on your writing as well. You know what I mean? You don't accidentally put 7 references to Horace in a book. It's not, it's not a coincidence and any stretch of the imagination. But when in your research of him, how does understanding that his work has this satirical layer to it, how does that affect like hermeneutics, like in general, right? Like not just with the Sterner, but with any piece of work, any piece of literature, like you have to apply that to your interpretation. Otherwise you're going to be missing a ton of the message behind it. And you could be, taking something that has a layer of irony as, being that person's actual opinion of something. You know what I mean? It's like basic media literacy, but also like PhD level media literacy. Like how do you apply that? Like, they teach this stuff to children, but you also have to do that in your PhD
I don't know
on this guy because his work is satirical and that like it's not a secret. So like how does that like affect your work? How did it affect your
Yeah, with Jenna, it's particularly difficult because, I mean, the last translator of his previous book, Wolfie Landstreicher, who made a lot of good corrections, but also doesn't understand the distinction between reason and understanding in German because he's not really philosophically trained for things. There's a problem with this satires and or parody angle sometimes, in which it does get you to sort of say like, if Stirner's wrong about anything, therefore it's not what he meant. It's like it's like an unironic version of the way some people defend, like, I don't know, some charlatan like Peterson or whatever. So I mean, at the time, so for the chapter 2, which is the biggest part of the thesis, I'm like, okay, he's using all of these Hegelian narratives about where history comes from, including including at some point some racial narratives. And I'm like, well, some people say this is all parody. So that's basically another way of saying stop asking questions about it. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm gonna research what the fuck parody is. I'm gonna read. I read this book called On Dostoevsky's Poetics by Mikhail Bakhtin, and it's basically has a theory of parody where it's based on this carnival theory where, in a carnival you would have sort of the decrowning of a king who is participating in the carnival and the crowning of a false king, and they're parading around. So it's a movement of crowning and decrowning, elevating the low, and and bringing the high down a peg. And it's kind of hard to do that with Stirner because at the first glance, it seems like he does this, whole developmental history of the history of philosophy and religion, in which he is on the other side of it, right? And this is clearly a parody of the other philosophers he's reading, who think that history develops in a certain linear way, more or less, towards them being at the top. So, for example, the reason why someone like Feuerbach thinks that, like Christianity is the real human religions, because Christianity for him is the most subjective religion, because in Christianity God becomes human, and therefore it's so close that we can actually overstep that boundary if we fully understand the logic of Christian religion, which he thinks Hegel achieved, and that's how he learned it, but she modified it a little bit. But I think there is nonetheless something of a satirical bent to Stirner's work, because he's talking to a very specific audience. It's honestly like talking. It's very Twitter, to be honest. It's just like talking to a similar audience of similar people who have all read the same books. It's more or less published by a small press. He's also writing for the message boards of their day, which was magazines in which people were always sniping each other using various silly names and the like. And so I do think the first half, at least a decent chunk of the first half of Stirner's book, is somewhat mocking the pretenses of his contemporaries to have reached the height of this developmental, I guess, pyramid of history. However, the second part of the book, he doesn't, he basically, in brief, all of these other people he was talking to wanted to present themselves as the culmination of philosophy itself. At the end of philosophy stands them, their ideas, and their vision of humanity. for them, sort of the human being is a result of philosophy. Now, for Stirner, and this is what gets him out of the stuff, because I mean, Stirner is a really good exemplar in those 3 paragraphs he talks about it of Hegelian style racism, which I can get into later. But it's essentially a style of racism that projects racial qualities onto racialized people. So essentially says, I can't be racist. I don't believe in essences. And he says at one point, says, people from the Far East, they believe in essences and therefore they can be racist. So it's a way of doing projecting. It's a bit like that joke in Austin Powers, when Austin Powers' dad says, there are 2 people I don't like in this world, people who are intolerant of other people's cultures and the Dutch. That's more or less the logic of Hegel's racism. But yeah, he does. But whereas all of these philosophers he's talking to see their vision of humanity as being the result of philosophy, he thinks his vision of humanity is actually not this totalizing higher stage, but rather a revolt against that entire logic of stages and indeed philosophy itself. So I think that's where the parodic aspect comes in. So he will take them to that top, and then he will, rather than decrown them, he will simply ignore the crown altogether. That's why it's not technically a parody, but it's definitely that similar influence of structure there.
Right. I mean, there's something, if it's not a parody, it's absolutely performative, right? There's this theatrical aspect to the literature that, I guess if you were looking at it sort of as a visual effect, you're not getting the visual effect, you're only getting the words on the page. So you're supposed to fill in some of that for yourself. You know what I mean? And within his audience would have recognized the parody and would have recognized the performance. And outside of that audience, you are left to fill in a lot of these gaps here. Sort of that, the esoteric, exoteric kind of a situation there where, you're speaking to one audience with ears to hear where the other audience, doesn't. So you have to kind of present it simultaneously. So, I think I maybe that simultaneous aspect to it, the esoteric and the exoteric, is a lot of where the parody is coming. You know what I mean, Johnny?
Well, yeah, I'm getting a lot of Goodwill Hunting vibes. A lot of I've read shit you've never even heard of yet. It's this weird, I don't understand it, but it's like a club that I don't belong in. You know what I mean?
And you're supposed to get that feeling. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you feel like you're in the club, that's part of the joke, is that the joke's on you if you feel like you're actually in the club.
Right,
you're not in the cool kid circle. You're not at the bar smoking the cigarettes and drinking the beers with them.
Yeah.
You're just reading the book and probably reading in a very bad translation, because the guy was a professional translator and knew what bad translations look like and knew what, how to write a text that will result in a bad translation from German to English, from German to French, from German to different languages, because he's used to taking he's used to taking texts from those languages and putting them in. So he's kind of doing that performative thing in reverse. And that's sort of the prank that's being played on the audience. You know what I mean? So parody is just one of the things that's in the toolbox of a satirist. You know what I mean? Satire itself, it what's the word I'm looking for here? It goes over, it transcends genre and mode and form. You know what I mean? You can have something that is satirical in form, but it's in the genre of anything. You know what I mean? So it's where exactly is the satire happening, and how are the tools once you know that it has that element to it. You know what I mean? So just because it's not a perfect parody doesn't mean it's not satirical. You know what I mean? Part of the satirical nature can be the imperfect parody. It can be a satirical parody, right? So then you're looking at that imperfect, you take them all the way up and then you won't do the inversion, right? That's part of the performance and the satirical nature of it. You know what I mean? You know what I mean, Johnny?
I'm starting to catch on.
You're starting to catch on, but did anything in that diatribe make any sense to you at all?
No, I think you're right to say that there's a distinction between parody and satire here, because I think I do think as well you can do a satirical or a satire to parody, because with with satire, there's more of a bite. I mean, for example, the movement I described of parody, where you decrown the king and recrown the king who's like a pauper or something. You invert the terms of order. Well, that requires the king to participate.
Right.
And therefore, are you really challenging the king? Like a satirist will say that, well, if the king is allowing themselves to be, decrowned, then that's only because you will recognize that even if he's not wearing it, he's still bloody got it on. You're not going to take orders from one or the other. And so I think what satire would do in that case would be as kind of a way of applying, dare I say, a dialectical negative. So a dialectical negativity, what does this mean? It just means we compare something to what it says it is, and then usually it doesn't do that. And how that develops is dialectic. Thesis antithesis never happened ever, but that's basically what a dialectical method is. And if you want to do a dialectical sort of satire of parody, you would say, you're meant to be decrowning the king, but you're only decrowning the king on the premise that he is obviously the crowned king, and that's why you put it back on afterwards. And I think that would be sort of what Stirner is doing to people like Feuerbach and Barrett, saying you're decrowning God, but you're putting him back up there as the human species, which is just equally an abstract idea of a personality, which no human being ever actually has. They have it within them in this sort of spectral sense. I'm respecting. If it says I don't respect this person, I respect the humanity in them. So basically, as long as you believe that there's this extra ideal thing floating within them, then you don't, you think it's okay not to kill them or something. That's what Stirner's worried about. Because with this crowning, you invent decrowning. With this decrowning, you invent a new form of crowning. In terms of, and that's what Stirner thinks about with his big target is humanism, because he thinks that as soon as you invent humanization, you invent dehumanization. We might as well stay back from this whole round dance. And I think that is what's going to be a satire of humanism, even if you want to do a satire on humanism's own attempt to parody religion.
Yeah, and he influenced a bunch of parody religions. The Church of the Subgenius, the Discordians, the Flying Spaghetti Monster. I mean, all of those parody religions were, the leaders like explicitly cite, Stirner as being an influence. I mean, Robert Anton Wilson. I mean, that's how I found out about Stirner when I was 14 at an anti-war fest or protest. I was hanging out with the cute girl and she was dressed up as a clown. And next thing I know, I'm reading Church of the Subgenius and praising Bob and reading all this stuff about Discordianism. And now my book is our book is absolutely Discordian in nature, you know what I mean? So, which ultimately comes out of what Max Stirner was doing with, like I said, throwing the chaos apples. Those chaos apples, those were eris, that's eristics, which is, that parody, Plato parodied eristics in the Republic, or one of them. He did where Socrates gets initiated by a bunch of sophists. That's an entire parody of eristics. And then Schopenhauer, was one of the leaders or early on to the German Silly Billy School of Philosophy. He writes that entire satirical book, How to Win Any Argument. The Art of Eristics. It's an entire Hegel's entire thing is dialectics. Okay, so Schopenhauer goes and does right and praises the eristics. There you go. You're just taking it and you're flipping it, right? So instead of praising dialectics like Hegel, was seen as doing, Schopenhauer with his anti-Hegelian stuff goes and writes a book that went on and influenced a bunch of people. And some people even use it without knowing that it's satire. It's kind of like his version of The Prince, where a lot of people don't recognize Machiavelli. That book is a piece of work of satire as well. It's where it's giving you the wrong advice. Don't go do this. You're gonna mess up. It has these layers that are lost on the average audience. But when you get into it and you get into the nooks and you see the way that was influenced and the way the satire was manifest itself, that eristics, which I don't want to say is anti-dialectics. It's not it's not really an accurate way to put it. It's an entirely different art form. It is the art of throwing the chaos apples. It's the art of, praising ad hominems and seeing the value of an ad hominem. You know what I mean? Like, a lot of these rules were only valid in formal debates. At the bar, you're not in a formal debate. You know what I mean? It's perfectly valid to, say that you're wrong and you're ugly. Like, it is perfectly valid in a street fight. It's a different rule set. Dialectics has its own rule set, and heuristics doesn't. Heuristics is the art of the low blow, the art of biting and doing all of that. So when when you're familiar with that and you're doing this Sternerian satire, the anti-dialectics and the anti-dialectics and the heuristics at certain points, like, what is going on here? It's kind of the same thing that we'll explore in our book, which is is it satirical philosophy, or is it the philosophical satire? Is it anti-dialectics, negative dialectics, or is it I don't think negative dialectics is the right term, anti-dialectics, or is it heuristics? What is actually going on here, and what's intended to going on? And also, do we necessarily care what he intended? What are we getting out of it? You know what I mean? I'm not writing a dissertation, I'm doing art. So I'm looking at it as the art perspective and saying, I'm getting certain things out of this that he probably didn't intend, but I happen to read a bunch of other stuff to it, so I'm applying that to it. You know what I mean? It's kind of the difference between looking at this as an artistic endeavor like I do versus what you've been doing with your academic endeavors.
Yeah, I've still not been to the Max Stirner opera. I'm in Leipzig. I have not been taking him on his most artistic direction. I mean, I know he's also very popular amongst some of the situationists as well. I believe Asker Jorn as well. I mean, it was interesting when you said negative dialectics and you sort of like corrected yourself a bit. But I think you're right. I think he's right the first time. I think negative, because I think one of the ways that satire can critique parody, right? It's a parody, and parody requires a kind of reconciliation. At the end of it, the pauper is the pauper and the king is the king of his crown. And this is one of the things I always disliked about my favorite Aristophanes, Lysistrata, because at the end it is this great parody of the patriarchal system of Greece. Because listeners, it's basically the entire plot is all of Greece are going to war at once. All women of Greece come together and say, we're going to go on sex strike until they,
Yeah.
I know. I mean, I think part of the and that was basically kind of the joke, because essentially men would be walking around with giant George cocks they haven't fucking fucked. So, and then eventually the goddess reconciliation comes in, and then and then women give up their strike, and everyone just has massive orgy. And I'm like, that's where the dialectics is all about reconciliation for Hegel, the positive kind, where you have these oppositions become reconciled or suspended in a higher unity. Stirner is going to be like, he's a negative dialectician. He's kind of like Adorno, who would come up later and say, no, the concept and the object that is conceptualized, the thing you apply it to, they're never going to be reconciled. There's always going to be one way in which the concept never quite gets all of everything it's trying to describe, and a way in which the object is never quite always something you can just have as an ideal or a word. And I think that's what good satire is. I think a good satire would be a negative dialect. It takes away reconciliation, which is also why you can't do satire all the time. Otherwise, you do eventually need some reconciliation, some kind of, in terms of otherwise it does become a kind of, well, a nihilism. Just a thing that points out that fundamental contradiction and then runs away and says everything is vanity. It becomes what Hegel would call like the unhappy consciousness that's yearning for this world beyond all contradiction and tension. And no, so I think there is definitely, I think if the satire is dialectical, it doesn't have to be, but I think it is definitely a negative dialectic where we just point out where things don't reconcile. And I think this is why satire has such an. I mean, I remember once Alan Moore described satire as a spell. Is that why? Because we. I mean, why the fuck do I know about Max Stirner? I don't know Max Stirner because Max Stirner wrote a book. I wrote about Max Stirner because Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote a book called The German Ideology, which isn't a book called The German Ideology. It's a book compiled from a Migger manuscript, which is called Saint Max, which is when this book came out from Sterne, they were so worried that the project of using Hegel for anything was over, because all that Sterne had to do was point to someone like Feuerbach and Bauer and said, you're just going to replace Christianity with humanism and not change any underlying structures. And then Feuerbach says, well, yes, that's what I said. And then Marx and Engels are like, oh, fuck, what we can do now. So in order to defend sort of using the logical method of dialectics in the same way, they write a paragraph by paragraph refutation of Sterne's book. And that's how most people know about it. Like, I mean, it's not that it was the only history there, but it's that satire is powerful because its negativity outlasts even its own time, especially if the author's not there to provide any sort of reconciliation. And that's why Alan Moore said, that a curse is fine. That curse lasts like one generation of children. A satire is a better curse because even after you're dead, like people will notice. People that Plato wrote about in his dialogues, if they were still there, exist for way longer than they did, and that's probably quite a curse if you're a Callicles or a Gorgias,
Well, if you ask me, Plato did it on purpose. So.
Oh yeah, he was a dark magician.
Yeah.
Hell yeah, man! I'm having fun, John. You learn anything yet?
I'm learning a lot.
You
Yeah.
learn a
How
lot?
does this book read now? Like, is there a lot of like cultural things that you have to like know about in order to get the satire? Is there a lot of like, I'm trying to wrap my head around like what I'm trying to ask. Do you have to be super educated to read this book and understand what Hegel was talking about, or I mean, Stirner was talking about?
Right. This is difficult because
I guess what I'm saying is, should I go get the audiobook of this tomorrow and start reading it, or do I need to read a bunch of stuff before it?
I mean, the thesis of the book is that you don't need to listen to anything I tell you about.
Yeah, that's totally fair.
But for me, if you want to understand, if you want to understand, if you want to like get the context more, I still do think you do. I think it is worth reading a lot of the stuff that he was reading at the time.
Yeah,
and I do think it's worth reading it after a few beers, but
not a problem.
Or just reading my thesis. I don't know, but the problem is in the Anglophone world, we never understood it in the context of this is a guy addressing a very small group of people. Mm-hmm. In a particular bar, in a pre-revolutionary time, in a post-revolutionary time, in Germany, and I mean, I don't tend to intervene in many of I see debates happening about Stirner online. I don't intervene in them because I'm like, well, this book is also something to have fun with. I don't think everyone who reads it needs to be like, you got to read the Jones first,
right?
So that you are kept away, because then I'm just kind of like that's not a fun way to read something. I mean, I would just have some guardrails at the very least of because some people read this book and oh, it means I can do whatever I want. And I'm like, that's not what he says. Some people come to this book looking for answers to specific philosophical questions, but no, this isn't a book about philosophy. This is a book about sort of what happens when you don't want to be involved in a kind of philosophy that tries to define what you are as a human being in terms of concepts. And I mean, there are some references that are kind of fun. I mean, I think it does help because some people, for example, read the first half of the book, which is kind of like a history of humanity and religion, as being completely accurate. And they're like, well, I really want to be a Stirner guy, so I need to believe what Stirner believed. And he wrote it down, therefore he believed it. And I'm like, dear God, no. No, I mean you'll be filled with so many 19th century racisms. I mean, which to be fair is mostly 21st and 20th century racism too, and indeed 18th and 17th century. But I mean, I don't know. I don't think I've written a prophylactic for reading this book. I guess. I mean, propedeutic, not prophylactic. Although they do have a similar function. I would just say. It depends. I think if I ask anyone who wants to cover this book the first time, would be, what do you want to read it for? If you want to read it to be like sort of this night, because some people read this book as him being this cool nihilistic meme man, and I'm like, no, that's not, doesn't quite work. I mean, like, I think one has to ask what questions one is bringing to the book.
Right. Yeah.
I'm talking about like it's dangerous here, but I think there are some pretty horrible misinterpretations that do lead people into some weird niche micro ideologies, like you know, sort of anarcho-capitalism. I mean, Mussolini read Stirner, as did Carl Schmitt, the Nazi jurist. There are a wide array of Stirners. You know, his concept of ownership was named the first gay magazine in Europe. There was the Egoist magazine was started by the suffragettes. And then you also get Mussolini, then you get some East German trade unionists, and then you get the Austrian Marxists, and then Carl Schmitt, the Nazi jurist. He's a land of contrasts. I don't want to monopolize any of that, but I do think at least some grasp of the history would be helpful.
Yeah.
I think not even the philosophy, the history, I think. Because sometimes people take this as a book that tells you that you can escape your own time entirely. They're like, no, it's a book about how in ways you're already kind of escaping your own time, but that's why your own time has all these systems to beat the shit out of you till you get back in it. You know?
Right. It's totally fair. I guess I was trying to get to the same question that I asked somebody who we interviewed who has a book about Robert Anton Wilson, is like how much of what he wrote is kind of normal thought now. You know what I mean? Like how much is it mixed in or that you know about him without knowing about him? You know what I'm saying? That's, I know that's kind of wordy.
No. I mean, I think he's still somewhat unknown in the cultural zeitgeist. I think there's an image of Stirner of this sort of, you know, it pleases my ego to do so, therefore I do it, which is culturally quite prevalent in terms of the meme, because we only have a drawing of him. There was a painting done on his deathbed, but it's been lost. And that meme image of Stirner has more currency than the man himself, which is completely fair, because that's, you know, meme, because you can't communicate anything else. But there are lineages of Stirner's influence, but they are all very suppressed, even in their own circles. So, like the first gay magazine in Europe, of course, destroyed by the rise of the Third Reich. In terms of, you know, the suffragettes, Dora Marsden was not a very prominent member, and of course, like, history isn't really taught anyway. We talk about the Pankhurst sisters, and like 2 of those were Nazis. So, you know. I mean, no, that's quite literal, by the way. I wasn't being like, look, the one of them went to go start a Nazi party in Australia,
right?
But and so the history is kind of suppressed. I mean, even Stirner was not a man known or even beloved in his own time. He had a very sad life. I mean, his gravestone was funded by Bauer and Arnold Ruge and a few others. You can still see it in. I mean, he spent most of his time in debtor's prison after writing this book. It was a very, very, very not. Yeah, and even then, most of his ideas people associate more with Nietzsche now. I mean, Nietzsche, similar circumstances, was born many years after Stirner. He was friends with Bruno Bauer and David Strauss as well, so he knew similar people. So he never cites Stirner, but Nietzsche's written a couple books. He wrote one book when he was responding to a different book someone else wrote, this guy Eduard Hartmann. And all the parts that Nietzsche is critiquing of this guy Hartmann's book are the parts that Hartmann is critiquing Stirner. So he clearly knew he existed. I mean, Bruno Bauer would have probably said, "Hey, my old mate Max," or I mean, and then also Nietzsche loved this big philosophy textbook that gave a history of materialism, the idea that everything is matter rather than ideas, and there's a short section on Stirner in that textbook, and says he's the greatest philosopher of the will since Schopenhauer. Now, I'm not meant to believe that Nietzsche, who loved Schopenhauer as much as he hated him, read that section and went, "I'm not going to read this guy's book now." Yeah. It's so Stirner's like lineage is kind of in the cultural unconscious of philosophy and politics, from anarchism, libertarianism of all stripes.
Yeah, I mean, I know about him because I grew up as a punk rock little anarchist kid running around, throwing rocks through windows and shit. So, I was that kid. So the book, it obviously wasn't meant for me yet it was meant for the 35-year-old me who read it and went, "Oh, I missed a ton of this when I was 15." Like there was so much of this that I didn't understand, I wasn't ready for. And now I'm, when I read it when I was 35, I was like, "Oh shit!" Like this would make even more sense when I'm 45. It's one of those books that like I want to read periodically and reread and reflect on what it was like reading it before. You know what I mean? Which is largely in that magical tradition, of satire, where it's this initiation kind of ritual. You know what I mean? I don't know if you know this, the anthropological origins of satire actually originate from the phallic poles that you would put in the ground, and then you would dance around them, and your footprints would basically make the pole shake, and that would be the pole would fuck the ground, right? That was the dancing, right? Now if you didn't participate in these rituals, there was somebody, usually a young kid, that was designated to go around and ridicule you for not participating in the rituals. If you didn't bring anything to the potlatch, you were ridiculed. If you were, didn't participate in the dance, you were ridiculed. And that ridiculer was the gadfly, who was the satirist, right? So the Greeks had the word to satirize, but they didn't have the word satire. They had satyrs, but they didn't have the word satire as like a literary genre form, but they had satirizing as this thing that came out of the iambs, the cult of Demeter, right? The Iambe was the one who made Demeter laugh, who gave her the rejuvenation to go down and to finally find Persephone. And that Iambe, she was that ichthyophallic hermaphroditic, she was basically, she's a belly that has a smiley face on it, and she basically did the Ace Ventura, where to make Demeter laugh, she used her vagina to flap and to talk with, right? So that comes out of iambs. That's that's where the name comes from. It's also known as Balbo. And then you get iambic poetry, which is Greek insult poetry, and that becomes an art form that you see replicated at the end of Aristophanes' Frogs, where they have the poet battle at the end of that. And you all have all these things that come out of these Dionysian rituals. So when you're the mindset of somebody like a Nietzsche or like a Bauer or a Karl Marx or a Stirner, and your point is to take and to invert this and to not complete the re-inversion and just leave it inverted, that's the point of the satire, the magic and the ritual that this stuff is actually coming out of. It's it's a 21,000-year-old ritual that dates back to, at least that we know, we have those phallic poles dating back at least 21,000 years, and every culture that we've ever seen that has these rituals has this satirizing gadfly character that ridicules you for not participating. So part of the ridicule that I am, that's all the harsh words, all this stuff comes out of that rich tradition, and it's really interesting that the German Silly Billy School of Philosophy was, they did it in their time and for their audience to recognize and to develop, and then other people like me and throughout history have taken it and added to it and done all sorts of stuff with it.
Well, it's funny too because there's no picture of this guy, so there's no photography of him. There's one painting, you said.
There was one painting, it's never been found. It's just there's two sketches that Engels drew.
Yeah,
he's 40 years after knowing him.
Completely unrelated, but it's just kind of so. Did this guy actually exist? You know what I mean? Like it's so fun. Like you could already start making up a mythicism about him, right? Like my friend Max, is like almost like a Bob character, right? Did Bob exist, or who is Bob? Is Max a different? I just that's where I go.
No,
it's fun.
I love that.
Go to Berlin with a shovel and see if there's anything under that goddamn stone.
Can we go to Hipples after? Is that place still there?
Hipples, I've looked for it. It's now like a parking garage.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that sucks.
If Hipples was still there, my god, yeah. No, it was just it was a back room. I mean, there's plenty of wine bars in Berlin.
Yeah.
It's also funny as well. I think that Sterner was himself a figure of great parody, well, actually, a great satire, as to accurately say. The Man Who Was Thursday by G.K. Chesterton, his sort of parody of the anarchists. That one of them is apparently based on Sterner. I mean, there was even a book it wasn't a parody, but it was a book in, I think, the 60s by Hans Helm, who's on the Frankfurt School, they basically blamed all the problems of society on Stirner and Adorno, and everyone was like, "What?" I mean, it does that. It does happen. I mean, even about a few years after his death, there was a psychologist, Ernst Schultz, who sort of gave Stirner as an example of a new type of schizophrenia, which is, I mean, it's interesting the link between being an anarchist. I mean, historically, being an anarchist is always correlated with medical pathology saying that you're schizophrenic. What's his name? Not Lombroso. I mean, Lombroso said that he was one of the guys who invented criminology. Cesare Lombroso said that anarchists had a kind of worse physiognomy. Of course, physiognomy is a pseudoscience about looking at how bodies shaped and like how people stand and look. And there was also another one, Edouard Seguin, that was it, who sort of wrote about sort of the disabled child is fundamentally an anarchist to be tamed. And I'm like, okay, this is where sort of Stirner comes in, because Stirner has a whole theory about sort of the 3 stages of life and how essentially society has to beat it into us, more or less, these ideals, faith, family, and flag. To borrow the Vichy France triplet that seems very popular these days.
Did he come up with that? Because I've heard that before.
What, faith, family, and flag?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's Vichy France. That's just me giving.
Okay.
That was
I was like, maybe I've heard this before.
Yeah.
That's the only thing in the entire interview you've actually heard before was that.
Yep, that one. Yep.
That's the France slogan, but yeah.
That's a great way to. That's hilarious, Johnny. I love it. But if you don't mind, I want to read you something from our book here.
Of course.
It's on my essay called "On Satire." I think you might actually really, really appreciate the way that it opens here. It goes like this. Quote, "It is customary to start a piece of this sort," which I'm being satirical by ending this piece, if you notice the inversion there that I did. "It is customary to start a piece of this quote with a dead German dude. I do not wish to offend my audience, so I shall indulge. Quote, the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of y'all struggling to understand satire. Fred Marx, On the Use Value and Abuse Value of History, page 666. Thank you. So that's from the Towel of Minerva.
I mean, it's also very good that you say it is customary to begin this essay with, which is of course a parody of Hegel's preface to Phenomenology of Spirit, which begins by talking about how shit prefaces are.
Hey, look at this. See, there's just layers upon layers upon layers.
But it reminds me of Plato, right? They kind of start the Critias and Timaeus like that, where they kind of like, well, let's, it's customary to tell you about what we talked about yesterday, just so you can get caught up about what we're talking about today. And oh, by the way, all of it's true, right? Like,
I mean, Lucian, his most famous work is The True Story, and he said that everything he said was true, and look out for a volume 2, and it never happened. Like that's part of the tradition, is not delivering on what you promised, and messing with your audience, and having that be, like. The part of the fun is that if people don't recognize that aspect of it, they're necessarily going to miss and be the butt of the joke. You know what I mean? Like, it's kind of you can think about the Fight Club effect. I talk about Fight Club so often, right? Fight Club's a work of satire, and a lot of people didn't know that and started actual fight clubs and got the shit kicked out of them. It's like if you had gone into it and just looked at the genre on the book, it says satire right there. Like, it's not hard to recognize that. You could have saved yourself several punches in the face by just recognizing that this is a work of satire, mocking the type of person like this that wouldn't recognize that it's a work of satire. So it's like meta satire, and part of that meta and the hyper satire is like part of the point. You know what I mean? Like, I guess we're coming up here on about 1 hour. Do you have any closing thoughts for for the audience? Anywhere they can go and get you and follow you and like follow your stuff, buy your tarot card, buy your all the listen to you talk for hours and
your naughty tarot cards.
I don't have any on me at the moment. I mean, in terms of the Well, I mean, I write books, but they're both being boycotted, including by me. So don't buy those. You can download all of my books from annasarchive.org or LibGen or anywhere else you get your legal downloads. Or if you're in contact with Acid Horizon at all, just message us/me, and I will send you a copy of them digitally. I don't have any physical ones left. I gave those away too. Yes, so you can find me over at Acid Horizon. I occasionally write over at Happy Hour at Hipples or New International Mag, where I'm also one of the editors. Occasionally do stuff for the website RS21, but most of my stuff will be on Acid Horizon. Hopefully, the Sterner text will become a book. I just need the people at Verso to fucking respond to their emails. But yes, there are the other books coming out so forth. So next thing coming out is Acephalus, the Erotic Tarot of George Bataille, and its companion book, Acephalus Compendium, which has 2 essays from me on war and non-knowledge, alongside works from Bataille scholar Stuart Kendall and the pornographer Vex Ashley, who has written a beautiful foreword. She was also on the episode we did on Battalion pornography with Noah Trepolino, who did artwork for that. That is, I think, enough plugs. Other than say thank you both for having me. It's been really fun. I don't talk about comedy or satire at all, and indeed in the context of Stiana, so it's really good. And thank you so much for the interest in checking the work out.
Well,
Hell yeah, man.
I think we could do this 1,000 times if you ask me.
Yeah.
I listen to you guys talk all day.
I mean, part of the point is we're talking past you, Johnny.
Well, no, you're talking through me, I guess.
There you go.
Right?
Yeah. You're the mediator.
I'm like a
you're the
reality
stand-in for the
tenant.
audience.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I'm okay with that.
You're the meta audience in this performance piece that we're doing here.
Yeah.
But this has been a lot of fun. I think we're gonna do the formal close thing and wish everybody a good night. Thank them all for coming out and watching our symposium, because I'm remembering that we have a symposium coming up in 3 weeks.
Yep.
So I'm putting myself in the future Mandy headspace.
Oh, yes.
And thank everybody. I'm going to say good night. You want to stick around? Let me grab your contact info and all that. I got a book to send you. I'll sign a copy and send it over to you, man.
Absolutely.
So, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night, Johnny. Throw the hand turkey.
Oh, yeah.
Hand turkey. There we go.